If you're ready, Sherri, I'll go ahead and get started.
I am.
Well, I'm Tamara with the Idaho Sheriff's Association, and I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, which is Sherri Cameron. She is the first Boise police, domestic violence detective, which is awesome. I did not know that about you, Sherri. She has served as a patrol officer, crime scene investigator, field training officer, and defensive tactics instructor. Sherri partners with the city and county prosecutors and victim advocates to ensure solid investigations are conducted while wrapping victims in services. She collaborates with the Family Justice Center and Women's and Children's Alliance. Sherri has been part of a multidisciplinary teams, domestic panels, and conferences. She is recognized expert on domestic violence, stalking, and strangulation in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th district courts, and testified on stalking in Idaho legislature. Sherri developed training for domestic violence, predominant aggressors, stalking, and strangulation. She provides this training to law enforcement and the community to help educate on all aspects specific to IPV. Sherri holds a criminal justice degree from Boise State University, a master's certificate from Post, and is a certified instructor. So we are going to be taking questions throughout the session. You are welcome to ask a question at any time, and it'll be addressed at that moment. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And from there, I will hand it over to you, Sherri. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right, so let's discuss intimate partner violence, specifically recognition of predominant aggressor. As we talk about domestic violence and predominant aggressor, the question often comes up, why should we care? Why do we care? And ultimately, domestic violence does in fact kill. It eventually will lead to victims that become victims of homicide when we do not step in and intervene. And if we are not identifying predominant aggressors and we are not taking the correct action and moving forward in these calls for service, we are not helping these victims and we are leaving them open and vulnerable. When we're looking at domestic violence victims, specifically when we're addressing predominant aggressors, these are women in the state of Idaho, and each of these women, as well as Joe DeLeon, are homicide victims at the hands of intimate partner violence, specifically predominant aggressors. And these are all within the last few years. And these are too many individuals that have been taken away from family and friends. And in some cases, these are individuals who reached out for help and did not necessarily get all of the help that they needed because they either were potentially denied an order, they didn't know how to fill out the paperwork, they didn't know who to turn to, they didn't know the information that was maybe necessary for law enforcement. And so this block of training, the hope is that each individual will be able to ask the questions and identify the predominant aggressor, with the ultimate hope that we can have less individuals on this slide in coming years. And again, this is not behind closed doors anymore. This is not private matter. Domestic violence affects our entire community, our cities, and our state. Each of these individuals had children that went to school with your kids. They went to church with you. They worked next to you or people that you knew, and they were friends and family to many. So the ripple effect goes out to the entire community. When we talk about intimate partner violence, it is the single most dangerous call to first responders. First responders, law enforcement as a whole, whether it's state, city, or county, when we respond to calls for service, domestic absolutely puts us in the face of danger. In uniform, we are the definition of power and control. We come in uniform, we walk into a room, and we control everything in that. We do that for our own safety as well as everybody's safety at that scene. We also have the ability and the power legally, the law gives us the ability to take people into custody. So when we walk in a domestic setting as law enforcement, we immediately can come into contact with a predominant aggressor. And domestic violence, it is about power and control. So we can butt heads with the predominant aggressor, and that is what also makes it very dangerous for all first responders to go to these. If that aggressor knows law enforcement is showing up, they can lie in wait for us. They can be ready to fire on us as soon as we exit a patrol vehicle or walk up and try to knock on a door. In addition to domestic violence being about power and control, they're very emotionally charged and volatile. These situations are filled with emotions. You have a victim that is traumatized. You have a victim that has been involved in this long-standing relationship and is conditioned to take blame and ownership. You also have the trauma that has happened. And so this alone can cause problems. On top of that, in a lot of these domestic calls, you can have substances that also impact that, whether that's drugs and or alcohol, that can also present an additional challenge and make the situation volatile for all law enforcement. It can be extremely difficult based off of drugs and alcohol alone sometimes to get to the bottom of what's going on. In addition, determining a predominant aggressor and taking that right step for law enforcement can be very difficult for us to do. But it is so important that we identify who that predominant aggressor is and that we remove them from that scene and from that location for the protection of everyone there. When we look at domestic violence, it's important to look at the definition of it. And when we look at that, it's a pattern of physical, sexual, and or emotionally abusive behavior. So it doesn't have to be one, you see, and or. It can be emotionally abusive and lead to only one physical act. And that physical act that occurs is the one that we show up for. Part of predominant aggressors' tactics they use is the emotional, mental, and psychological. So that abuse happens before the physical and sexual. And when we are at a scene and trying to determine that aggressor, we do need to ask those questions of what's been going on in the past. Are you working? Does he work? Also, just for purposes of this training, I will, for ease of talking, I will refer to a predominant aggressor as male and a victim as female. What I will say is we know that predominant aggressors across the United States are on the rise for being women. It's not equal to, but we do know that they are on the rise. But for ease of training, I will refer to it that way. So when we're talking about the mental, the psychological, and the emotional abuse, we have to inquire about that. We've got to get that information and that backstory, which helps present the whole picture. Because that single physical act may not help us to identify who holds that power and control. And if you're looking at the definition, that power and control is utilized over that victim in order to keep them in the relationship. It keeps the victim guessing, it keeps them undermined, and it keeps the victim not knowing what's going to happen yet. The next step, the victim is constantly on defense. And so they're not able to move forward and even recognize sometimes what's going on. So when we look at predominant aggressor, I'm going to give you your pre-test. This is a little video, and I would like each of you you can put it in a chat if you want, or just say it to yourself. Who's the predominant aggressor here? All right, there's your pre-test, and we're going to go through and help to identify which of those two cats is our predominant aggressor, and you will have a post-test at the end. When we are looking at predominant aggressor, the question arises, why does it matter? Why do we need to identify this person? In order to do the job which we need to, provide services for a victim, make sure that the correct person is charged and going through the court system, wrapping a victim with services, we have to identify the predominant aggressor. Ultimately, when we do this, not only are we fulfilling every role that we need to be doing, but we also are allowing for resources to go to the correct party and hopefully lead to fewer dual arrests. When you see dual arrests and dual charging, that is more rare to ever occur in a predominant aggressor dynamic or intimate partner relationship. Predominant aggressor defined, the dominant or most significant person. This is the person that when you walk in, you can feel that they have the power in the room. They're controlling every aspect. The predominant aggressor will actually show you their power and control. They will call out the name of the victim. If the victim's name is Jennifer, they'll yell at Jennifer to come out here now. It's a direct order, and that's a powerful order. When a victim comes out, you will see often that the victim is coming out with maybe shoulders slumped over a little, eyes looking down, won't make direct eye contact with you. Oftentimes, you may even see that the victim in this relationship will not look at you when answering questions or look at the abuser for permission to speak. If you ask the victim to step outside of the house or to go into a different room, they will look towards the abuser first for permission. If we are not watching the body language that's occurring when we are on scene, it is easy to miss these types of signs that are shown because they are nonverbal. But those are all displays of asking for permission and showing you who elicits that power, who holds that control in the relationship. And this is a constant pressure that is there. Domestic violence is not just one single incident. It is a course of conduct. And I really like this slide because it shows you the tip of the iceberg. That is what is often seen in public. You may see a couple and they're arguing, and you may see a push. What you're seeing in public, what you're seeing the tip of that iceberg, that is nothing compared to what is happening at home behind closed doors. As we discuss predominant aggressor, it is important to identify and recognize that there can be a primary aggressor. These can sometimes be used interchangeably. They are not necessarily the same thing. The primary aggressor is the first person who employs hostile force. That hostile force doesn't have to be strangulation. It does not have to be punches to the head. That hostile force, that first touch, could be a push. So for example, the primary aggressor, you have a husband and a wife. The husband comes home and he's been drinking. He sits in his chair. The wife is asking him to come and help her do something or do some chores. It's dinner time, come to the table. The husband gets mad and he gets up, and the wife may push him. The husband responds to that with strangling his wife. Now, that's a disproportionate response to a push to go to the lethal strangulation. The person in that scenario that is the primary aggressor would be the wife. She is the one that did the touching first. It's important to understand the primary aggressor because in these cases, when you have intimate partner violence with a predominant aggressor, a wife who may have done the touching first will own the entire physical acts that occurred and say, it was my fault. I started it. And the husband will also say, she started it. I was defending myself. Strangulation is not a proportionate response, nor is it defending himself to a push. So again, it's important to know that there can be a primary aggressor. We will document that. For law enforcement, we document everything. We do not leave it out. But we also don't have to charge the female with domestic battery misdemeanor. That would be an error on our part to double charge. There's that dual charging, dual arrest. Again, it's looking at everything that happened, the totality of that situation, what happened prior, and then the disproportionate response of that predominant aggressor. He is looking for justification to use that level of force and the lethality on his wife. If we, as law enforcement, walk into a call for service and we have a wife say, I started it, I pushed him, I implore you to be careful with getting stuck on the wife touching first, because when we only look at the primary aggressor, we are ultimately ignoring the real threat, the predominant aggressor in that, which is the husband. And ultimately what we may get stuck on is leading to the arrest of the victim in this, which ends up harming the victim in more ways than just that single arrest. As we talk about predominant aggressors, it is important to understand and recognize that there is situational violence. When we are looking at situational violence, that's when you are looking at your mutual combat. You can have mutual combat, but it's in situational violence. So for example, this is heat of emotions. Situational violence. There's no history of emotional, financial abuse. There's no psychological abuse. The marriage seems to be okay between a husband and wife, nothing really good or bad, it's just marriage. And the husband comes home from work and he finds his wife in bed with his brother. His emotions take over. He allows his emotions to take over. He becomes enraged that his wife is in bed with his brother, and he punches his brother and he punches his wife. By definition of our statute and looking at our codes, they're married, they fall under household member. That would be domestic violence, domestic battery in our state. In that case, when you do not have that pattern and the predominant aggressor with power and control, this would be an example of a situational violence. It can be a solo act, a first time with nothing else behind it. In situational violence, you'll also see frequently, you'll have alcohol and drug use or abuse. It doesn't mean that alcohol and drug use in IPV, intimate partner violence, it does not mean that all alcohol and drug use is situational. You will just see that more frequently. You can also see with mutual combat in a situational violence, boyfriend, girlfriend that are living together, go to the bar, both become intoxicated. They get upset over flirting that happened in the bar. They come outside, they've both been drinking, and the boyfriend calls the wife a bitch. She slaps him and he slaps her back. In situational violence, this would be situational. It's heat of emotions, alcohol abuse or alcohol use during that time. This isn't power and control. They both have slapped each other. The difference in situational violence, especially for law enforcement in interviewing, is when you interview both of those individuals, they both take accountability and responsibility for what they do. The girlfriend will say, he called me a word and I don't like it and I slapped him. And he will say, she slapped me, so I slapped her back. Both of them will give you the information and the story. With predominant aggressor, your interviews will not be like that. An interview with a predominant aggressor, he will not admit to any physical act unless there is a witness, and then he will only give that information which he knows you will discover. He will not give anything more than that, and he will deny everything. And even when he does admit to something that you would find out, he will blame the victim. He will still try to justify the action he did and place the blame on the victim. So it is very different in situational violence, and we do have the situational violence. Per statute, that is still domestic battery. We do not walk away from this. We still take law enforcement action. We still document, we still report, we cite, we arrest. But the main difference behind a situational violence is this one is not about power and control. So for the rest of this presentation, we will focus solely on predominant aggressor and not the heat of emotions, the mutual combat. Predominant aggressor statutes, we do not in Idaho have one. We are one of just a small handful of states that do not have a statute yet. So this training is important because we don't have clear definition. The hope is that the more that law enforcement is identifying predominant aggressor, the more training we do. Ultimately, when we get that statute, that it will actually be applicable to what we're doing, that the wording will come from the training that we're receiving instead of some erroneous or unclear definition of what a predominant aggressor is. So not having that statute right now, we do have to look at the laws we have, and the training is important because we don't have that clear definition. Some of the laws we've got are assault and battery, domestic battery, stalking, kidnapping and false imprisonment, and all of these can and do apply in domestic settings, in intimate partner violence. We also have unlawful, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. There was a question a while back about dual arrests, and I was just wanted to know if that was something you were going, or the person wanted to know if that would be something you would cover today.
Covering dual arrests, is there anything more specific?
There just, it says, is it still common to have both parties arrested when it is not clear who the predominant aggressor is?
You can, and I will cover a little bit about that when I do have some information about mutual combat, self-defense, and then some on dual arrests. So if I don't cover a specific question for that individual, if they can, once I cover that part of it, if there's more, please ask a question and then I can address that. Anything else, Tamara?
No, sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
No, you're good. Interrupt away anytime. I would prefer you guys ask the questions and I'll answer them right away.
Okay.
So some of the other domestic violence laws, we've got unlawful entry, vandalism. Vandalism is kind of a difficult one for us because community property, state in Idaho, and a lot of times your victims are not going to want to do anything about it. We still, as law enforcement, need to document all vandalism, all malicious injury to property. Not only potentially can a prosecutor add that charge, but it also tells the story of what happened. It's corroboration toward what the victim is telling you, what the suspect said. Does it agree with the story, or is the damage inside of a residence or the damage in a car, does it not fit the story? If our evidence does not match, we have a duty and responsibility to go back and ask more questions. Destruction of telecommunication device and prevention of 911, you will see those frequently in IPV. One of the things I will hit on with that really quick is in your areas, be familiar with, does your department have phones to provide to victims? If your law enforcement agency does not, where do you get those? Do you have an advocacy center? Do you have victim witness coordinators in your department that can reach out and get phones? Do the prosecutor's office have the ability to get any? Where can you get these phones in order to give them to victims? Because if we cannot reach them, and by we, the entire judicial system, advocates, victim witness coordinators, prosecutors, law enforcement, including first responding officers and detectives, we have to be able to reach the victim. Not only do we need to reach them for follow-up information, but to ensure that they are safe, they're okay, nothing else has happened. So we've got those two crimes as well. And then another one is protection order and no contact order violations. So we have several laws that help us when we're looking at crimes, when we respond out and taking action. Levels of abuse, neglect, exploitation and abuse. With neglect, a lot of times in that one, we are talking about individuals that cannot care for themselves, which potentially could be elderly, as well as developmental disabilities would fall under neglect. Exploitation, frequently we're talking elder as well. Now, exploitation, however, can also occur in intimate partner violence. And what the crimes we're looking at that were not included under there would be some of the sexual abuse related crimes. Exploitation, is he forcing her to take pictures? Is he recording? So that would be exploitation, and there is a whole separate list of statutes to cover that. Our focus in this right now will be on the abuse, which is the physical, emotional abuse toward a victim in that relationship. When Men Batter Women, which is a book, it's an excellent read. I know sometimes the title itself can throw some people off, but when you're looking at the different types of offenders, one of the things they identify in that, and Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about it as well in his presentations, is there's two types of categories of offenders when we talk about predominant aggressors. We have a pit bull, and pit bulls can be very scary. The second slide I showed you with the women and the one male that have died, a lot of those offenders that committed the homicide and killed their ex-partners were in fact in the pit bull category. Now, don't get me wrong, I did not name these. I love pit bulls, and I will tell you my daughter actually has 2 pit bulls. They're great dogs. What we know about them is that pit bulls are very loyal, and they have a deep emotional attachment. That's the characteristic that they associate with this category of predominant aggressors. That deep emotional attachment is too deep. They can't cut that off. So when a victim, if you look at the third bullet, the victim is more likely going to leave this offender. They'll leave the relationship. That offender, that predominant aggressor that's a pit bull, cannot let go. That emotional attachment is so deep, and they fear the abandonment, that they will continue to follow, harass, stalk, go after, contact. They won't let go of the victim. Now, the danger with this is they are also most likely to kill the victim because they can't let go. The mentality of, you're mine, nobody else can have you, I won't let anybody have you. If I can't have you, no one will. And that is some of the thinking that comes out with that deep emotional attachment and that fear of abandonment because the victim has left. So this is a highly dangerous category in terms of homicide or femicide with intimate partner violence towards our victims. And these are the ones for law enforcement when we respond to. For community, if you have a friend, if you're talking to someone and they are discussing that their ex or future ex can't let go, is calling them at work, is showing up at places, is begging to meet with them, you need to encourage the reporting of this behavior, because that behavior actually fits course of conduct for stalking, and it needs to be taken seriously. As law enforcement as a whole in this state, we have got to get past the single, solo, isolated crime and look at the big picture, the dynamic stalking intervention. The second category is cobras. For cobras, they are extremely violent, so they're quick, that quick snap, quick dangerous. These are individuals, though, that they do not have an emotional attachment, and they'll snap. So everything can seem fine. The victim will say, I have no idea what happened. All of a sudden he became violent, and it is an extreme violent. She has been hit, punched, kicked, and strangled, and has multiple bruises all over and cannot tell you what happened and why it happened. The cobra will also allow the victim more freedom. So they're not as controlling because that emotional attachment is not there. There's a void. The Cobras are also, if you look at the last bullet on there, will have a reduced heart rate during arguments. This can pose a problem because when we are interviewing and speaking with someone, if the individual is emotional, if they're crying, if they're hyperventilating, if they're having trouble recalling the details, which clearly describes a lot of victims, they're not able to put things in sequential order. They can't remember everything that happened. We have a harder time with believing everything versus an individual we're talking with that is calm, cool, collected, and able to tell a story or statement from beginning to end, and it seems logical and consistent to us. That's what a Cobra will present as. They have a reduced heart rate, so they don't have the emotions involved when they're telling their statement or story of what happened. And because it is calm, it can happen that law enforcement or anyone else can put more value in the statement from the Cobra than from the victim, because the victim is appearing as more emotional, hard to understand. When we look at the types of abuse from a predominant aggressor, the verbal, emotional, psychological occur first. Those three have to happen first. And it is a process getting into this relationship with a predominant aggressor. It's a process to get out. That verbal, emotional, psychological has a sole purpose. It is to break down the psyche of the victim. Self-confidence, self-worth. It is statements to demean, belittle, and put down the victim. It is breaking them down. You will see often that these relationships are very fast. The predominant aggressor has to have that control. If they are not living with the victim, they will move in quickly because they can't control if they're not in the same residence. They will get engaged faster. From the time that they first met dating to getting married, if that's where they're at, that will be fast and accelerated as well. It'll be the, I don't want to wait. I love you. I want to be with you now, when you talk to a victim. And they will then be able to control, when they're in the house and married, the economic. You will see in economic abuse, the victim will not have access to funds, even if they're married. Community property state, and she has no access to a checking account. She doesn't have any credit cards in her name. He has the credit cards. She's given an allowance. She works and he gets the paycheck. Those are all signs of economic or financial abuse. And a lot of times victims don't recognize that this is abusive behavior. Then we have physical and sexual abuse. In those two, physical abuse, victims will oftentimes recognize that the violent physical is not good. But what happens is, as each of these abuse levels are occurring, the initial physical, the first incident that happened, your victim will recall. As the escalation of physical occurs, though, your victim will not be able to necessarily recognize that a push, a slap, or even a punch was a physical violent act, because they have leveled or placed the violence on different levels. So pushing and slapping to them is an everyday occurrence, not a big deal. They won't even talk about it. When they give you information about physical abuse, they will talk about strangulation. Law enforcement has to specifically ask, have you been pushed? Has he ever pulled your hair? Has he drugged you? Has he kicked you? Has he bit you? Because your victims will not even be able to recognize that that is something that they should report, or that that is a crime. That goes the same with sexual abuse. When you've got a victim that has been so broken down by verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, I have worked with many victims that will discuss their sexual relations with their significant other, which are clearly abusive, and the victim has no idea that the significant other should not or could not have done that to them, that that was a crime. So they are so programmed and conditioned into that power and control and that cycle that the predominant aggressor has the ability to do whatever they want with that victim. Emotional, verbal, and psychological can look oftentimes like this. These are statements that you may hear. If you are a therapist in here right now, if you're a victim witness, you may hear these kinds of statements from people you work with. For law enforcement, we need to listen to these when we show up on scene. If they're ridiculing or insulting the gender as a whole, so putting down women as a whole, putting down men as a whole, including religion and other valued beliefs by the victim, humiliating them in public. If they do it in public, I guarantee you it is worse at home. So if they openly do it, it's the same for physical. If they push their wife in public, it is worse at home. Another emotional is withholding any affection, approval, appreciation. That is emotional, verbal, and psychological. And again, these happen first. Criticizing, manipulating them, which is oftentimes gaslighting, making a victim feel like they're crazy, making the victim doubt their own beliefs or their thoughts, and then threatening to leave, the fear of abandonment. As humans in general, we do want to belong. That is one of the things that human beings crave. We want to belong, and we constantly look for that no matter where we are. In this whole environment right now, we all have a connection. We're here to learn about domestic violence. We're here to help victims. We're also here to potentially, if you're on here and you're working with offenders, it's rehabilitation, programs, treatment. So we're all here and we all belong to this. When a victim is threatened by a predominant aggressor that they are going to leave, that fear of abandonment takes over, and the victim will do things that they didn't think that they ever would because that fear of abandonment. And it's another manipulation tactic that an abuser will use. Frequently, predominant aggressors will accuse victims of having affairs, monitoring their cell phones. Who were you talking to? Who are you texting? You need to show me that. You need to let me see it. And all the while, the abuser is frequently the one that is having an affair. Keeping a victim from working and controlling them, driving them back and forth to work, making all the decisions, keeping the money from them, abusing pets as well, which is a very psychological. In a home, abusers will not only abuse, but can torture and kill pets, and they will do it not only in front of the victim, but they can do it in front of the children as well because of the psychological message that's sent. I can do this and nobody's going to do anything. And if you step out of line, you're next. Threatening to take the kids is another one as well that is very emotional, mental, and psychological in all aspects. Physical abuse can look like pushing, shoving, holding them down. Again, when I talked about predominant aggressors, they may give some statement that they touched a victim, but this would be a time that they would justify it. She was trying to hurt herself, so I held her down. She was going to run into the road, so I grabbed her and carried her out of the road. They will give some justification for what they did only because a witness saw it. Slapping, kicking, and then going all the way up to strangling and choking. Throwing objects at a victim, the object can strike them or it may strike near them, and then other things can hit the victim. Reckless driving, we have seen a little uptick in driving, specifically intimate partner violence, domestic violence occurring in a moving vehicle. Not only across the state through ISP, they've seen this, but we have a lot of calls for service coming in on reckless driving that are domestics in progress in a vehicle. It's not only a physical, but it's a psychological abuse that's occurring at the same time. If the victim's driving, forcing them off the road by grabbing the wheel, trying to take over, or chasing them in another vehicle. Locking a victim out of a house, abandoning them, forcing them to get out on the roadway and leaving them someplace. And then the last one would be refusing to help them if a victim's sick. I've had cases where victims had recently had surgery and the abuser will not help them. That is another form of physical abuse. And sexual abuse, this is what it can look like. Again, it's not an all-inclusive list, but these are some of the more common ones that we can see. Accusing a victim of having an affair, we talked about, calling them names like whore or slut, telling demeaning jokes towards the victim's whole gender. So negative, demeaning jokes about women as a whole. Jealousy, that isolation, constant accusals, withholding sex and affection from them and or rewarding them. Both of those are sexual abuse. Whoops. I think I skipped a slide. I got to go back. Okay. Criticize sexually the victim's feelings about sex. So putting them down. It's all about the abuser. The abuser's needs, what they want, what he wants. It doesn't matter what the victim wants. Forcing them to dress more sexually or stripping in front of them, uncomfortable touching, and any type of forced. Those last three are all forced. Forcing sex with an abuser, with someone else. The abuser may watch, they may videotape it, forcing them to do sex acts, using objects on the victim, and or beating the victim during or after sex. Those are all forms of sexual abuse. And I list those because in this environment where we are right now, I can read this list to you and we all look at that and say, I can see that sexual abuse. I would recognize that. And we think it's logical, makes sense for all of us. Your victims living in that home with a predominant aggressor do not recognize these. We have to talk about them with them. So as we talk about the lethality, we have to look at the cycle of violence and the escalation of violence. Sexual abuse increases lethality, as does strangulation when it's escalated to those two factors. So the cycle of violence looks like this. Tension building, that's your predominant aggressor. They are justifying in their own mind the second stage or step of the cycle, which is a violent act. That's the physical. The third part of that cycle is the honeymoon. This is the apology time. That does not mean your predominant aggressor will say, I'm sorry. It means the predominant aggressor will say, you know, I don't like that. If you wouldn't have done that, this wouldn't have happened. Now, for us in this environment, in training right now, all of us can recognize that is not an apology. However, for your victim, they don't hear the same thing we do. They hear, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. They're hearing an apology. Your victims will buy back into it and that cycle continues. This cycle speeds up. You can have a marriage where they're together 20 years and they have a first violent act. The second violent act will not take 20 years. This cycle will increase. As it's increasing, so does the escalation of violence. It goes from verbal to property damage to physical. And again, you can have verbal for 10 years. They can escalate to property damage for another 2 years. And at year 13, you have physical abuse. The next incident that happens, you've got verbal, property, and physical all at once. So both the escalation and the cycle speed up and happen more frequently. This is the continuum, much like I talked about with physical. You can start with push, punch, escalating up to strangulation, use of a weapon. What's important about the physical specifically is if you have strangulation and let's say your victim leaves the relationship, your offender finds a new person to be with, intimate partner, they start with strangulation. They do not go back to the first one. They don't go back and say, oh, I have to start with a push to a punch. They will pick up with strangulation. The Idaho Risk Assessment of Dangerousness, which if you did not attend that, and I apologize, I don't remember the order. If you did go to that, Angela talks about this. I encourage you to be familiar with the Risk Assessment of Dangerousness. Law enforcement in the state of Idaho needs to be using this on every domestic call. These 7 things help us understand risk to victim and lethality. The more of these that we have checked and marked in interviewing a victim, the more risk to the victim. We need to follow up quicker, not only for law enforcement, but advocates, victim witness. We need to wrap them with services. Prosecutors need to be aware of this as well, to ask for high bond, ask for potentially GPS monitoring. So this risk factor needs to be utilized by every facet in the criminal justice system. The tactics that an abuser uses, we've discussed minimizing it and justifying it. They also will intimidate. And they can do that both verbally and physically by sheer body size or by a nonverbal language or threats. Children are frequently, if children are in the relationship, children are one of the biggest tactics that are utilized. If you leave, you will not have the children. If you leave, I will kill the children. Financial abuse will prevent a victim from being able to leave if they have no money to allow them to live if they leave the relationship. Religion, exposure. If the religion is important to the victim, your abuser will absolutely use religion against them, as well as cultural beliefs. Exposure to the church, exposure to the community, threatening the victim that they will be kicked out of a church or that they will be embarrassed, as well as any other coercion and threats. Predominant aggressors will lie, they'll justify and minimize, and they constantly justify and minimize almost everything they do. Gaslighting, making a victim believe they're crazy, and denial. Denial will happen unless there's a witness. At which point the justification and minimization comes in. Experienced batterers don't strike in the face anymore. They are hitting in places that we can't see. They often will call 911 first, and the reason behind that is if a predominant aggressor calls 911, a lot of times we still hold this belief that whoever calls 911 must be the one that needs help. So they've learned if I call first, then I might be assumed to be the victim. Your experienced batterers and aggressors will destroy the evidence and clean up the scene prior to police arrival. And they will intimidate a victim while the police are on scene. This intimidation is not verbal though. The intimidation can be staring at them. The intimidation can also be tapping a wall, and maybe that's where the abuser had thrown the victim into, that wall where he's tapping, reminding that victim in an intimidating fashion. And they won't take responsibility. That's the justification and minimization. This all happens on scene with law enforcement. The behavior of a victim, we know they can be what we'd call hysterical, screaming, not making sense. They can't finish a sentence. They can't even put it all back together. They're crying. They may even hyperventilate. And the memory loss. We have a difficult time when people don't tell us information. They pause. I don't remember. I don't know. Those answers, sometimes we can be real quick to say they must be lying. Because of trauma and what happens during traumatic incidences, the brain can shut down information that is not vital to our survival. Until the brain relaxes and feels safe, it will then release details. In some of those cases, when it's released, we will be able to get the information, either details or put in sequential order. If you have strangulation and the victim was strangled to unconsciousness, they will never have memory of what happened because we do not formulate memory when we're unconscious. So remember that if there is memory loss and they don't know, it could either be they were knocked unconscious, strangled to unconsciousness, or they're so traumatized that they cannot provide the information all the way through yet. Hence, second or third victim interviews are imperative to get the details. We don't want to overlook bruising and contusions that don't match. If there is injuries on a person and it's not matching the story, we have a responsibility to ask more questions. Injuries in areas that you shouldn't have or that you couldn't do to yourself. because it can be, well, she did it to herself. Well, she's clumsy. She's drunk. She's an alcoholic and she tripped and fell on her own. Well, her bruise doesn't match. It's in an area you wouldn't get a bruise. And then we don't want to overlook strangulation signs and symptoms, especially given the lethality of strangulation. Some areas that have been hidden where we're finding injuries, if it's wintertime, the legs and even the arms, because wintertime, you're wearing long sleeves. If it's summertime, we can see injuries on the bottom of the feet, burn marks, scrapes, bruising, because even in the summertime, you're still wearing shoes. So they'll be in hidden areas. If you look at these pictures on here, if you look at the guy in the middle that has the bloody nose, the question would be, is he an abuser or is he a victim? In the upper right corner, and the young girl you can see with the black eye, is she a victim or is she an abuser? And then in the bottom left, you see the woman with scratches on her neck. Now, frequently when I ask this question, the answers that I'll get back is the man in the middle. People are very quick to say he's a predominant aggressor. The girl with the black eye, frequently the answer is she's a victim. It's a little bit of a trick question and trick slides because we don't want to jump to conclusions until we have the full story and the evidence matches. The man in the middle could very easily be a victim. And we still know that male victims do not come forward as frequently. It still is not as accepted. It's better, but it still is not as accepted. So we have to be careful about making judgments based only on what we see without asking questions. Here's our mutual combat. So mutual combat is basically two people agreeing to fight. If you watch any type of MMA or cage fighting, there are rules in those, and both parties adhere to those rules. They both agree they're going to fight each other. They know that if one person taps out, it's done. Fight's over. We don't have mutual combat in intimate partner violence. We don't have people that come home and say, you know what? I think I want to get in a fight with you, husband. Okay, let's do it, wife. Let's go. Both of us are going to go fight. That's mutual combat. You don't have that in intimate partner violence, not with a predominant aggressor. A predominant aggressor holds power and control. When there are generally injuries on both parties, the victim is using it in self-defense. The victim is trying to escape. The victim is trying to get away. And if cornered, they're trying to survive. So we don't deal with mutual combat, generally speaking, in predominant aggressor. You do in situational violence, but you do not in predominant aggressor. The power and control is with the abuser. You can't tap out in these relationships. With mutual combat, what we will see, and this leads to often that dual arrest, the question that came up, if we're not delving into how these injuries occurred, was somebody using self-defense? Does it make sense if he says, I was defending myself and all her injuries are on her back? He's not defending himself. We have to be really careful about asking the questions and putting it back together with everything, every witness, the statements made, the evidence at the scene, the bruising or injuries if we have any. All of that needs to match up. If we do not do our due diligence to do this, we take a shortcut and we can oftentimes charge them both, either dual charge or dual arrest, and call it mutual combat. Predominant aggressor, remember, it is very, very rare and infrequent you will have mutual combat in a predominant aggressor relationship. We do have the right in Idaho to defend ourselves, and nowhere in any of the codes does it say you cannot defend yourself if you're in an intimate partner relationship. So you still have that ability. What we know with predominant aggressors, considerations we need to take when we're identifying it is the person trying to exert the power and control, and the other one is using some force to fight back or escape. If she's trying to get out of the house and she can't, then she may fight back. given her size, she could, if she's small and he's large, she may use an object. She could grab something nearby to hit him so she can escape. When you show up, who's got the injuries? He may have a cut on his head. And she'll say, I hit him with an ashtray. That doesn't mean that we want to focus only on him having an injury and her having none. Again, we have to match up everything. Why, where was the ashtray? Well, it was in this area in the corner. Well, how come you had it? Because I was backed into the corner and he was coming after me. So again, we've got to ask all those questions. If we do not identify the aggressor, we empower the abuser. And his power keeps intact. I told you so. See, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to get arrested. You're going to get charged. Everything he told her comes true. Keeping in mind victim strategies is essential. Women typically use violence in self-defense or to escape. They will try to escape, and if they can't, they will use something to get away. We are seeing more frequently that victims are photographing their injuries after the fact and trying to keep them either hidden or sending them to friends or family for safekeeping. Ask those questions. That's evidence that helps us. They're date stamped. And we have also seen audio recording of the fight. Even if we can't see it, can you still hear what's happening? Does the information that they're providing match up to the verbal you're hearing in the audio recording? And understanding that primary aggressor role, the victim may in fact initiate the violence because it's the only part that they can control. You can see a victim push their spouse to start a fight if they know that their kids are going to be with grandma and grandpa tonight, and they know, victims know when that justification part, that tension building, they can sense that. They know it's that the violence is coming, it's imminent. And the only part of that they can control is when it happens. If the kids are gone tonight, she may actually initiate by a push to get the fight done because the kids are gone. And again, your victim will tell you, I started it, I pushed him. Other considerations, women are generally smaller. So if they use something, is that, are they the abuser in that? Are they the aggressor at that time? Or were they using that in order to get away? And generally, women's violence is more reactionary. These are the things we have to look at in identifying a predominant aggressor. Who is dominant there? Who holds the power and control? Who's creating the fear? Who's trying to stop it versus avoiding it? We still need to consider, but it's not one of these, it's all of these. Age, height, weight of parties. Who's stronger? Is one of the parties specially trained? For example, are they MMA, special forces? Do they have some specific training that gives them, an edge on the other person? And looking at the seriousness of the injury, where is the location of it? How did it occur? All of these come into play in determining that predominant aggressor, not just one. Additionally, location of the injuries, previous knowledge we may have. Is somebody on domestic violence probation already? Alcohol and drugs, history, self-defense, and corroborating evidence or witnesses. Again, it is all of these factors that are building toward the identification of a predominant aggressor to remove them. Our goal is to keep the children with the victim, not with the abuser. We want to take them out of the scenario and give the victim a chance to breathe and figure out where they're going to go next, wrap them with services, and help them see that there is hope and stop re-victimization. We really need to focus on the arrest considerations of not doing a dual arrest. We don't want to arrest because we can't sort it out or figure it out. We don't want to take them both. We really need to identify who is it that needs to be removed from this relationship or this scene at this time. Dual arrest and charges, the problem it presents is that the victim won't call us again. The prosecutor will decline because you've got dual charges, and children on a dual arrest can be placed needlessly with others or taken even into foster care if there is no one to take them. You're reinforcing everything that the batterer told them, and the promise of our protection is broken. The message to the abuser, they're empowered. They can do anything they want. They feel invincible, and your offender is free. The victim's credibility becomes stripped, and when that happens, not only is that one thing, but the victim has no way out, and we can strip them of services in the community because now they have a charge against them. Children will learn to distrust us, and we leave finances, animals, and the children in the hands of the abuser. For purposes of time, I'm going to skip that part. It was just an example. What are our challenges? Sorry, that was with that. Helping victims. We need a proactive advocacy plan. We need to support our victims, bring them back in. Safety plan. Law enforcement, you guys need to work with victim witness and advocates, work with your prosecutors as well. We all work together to do a safety plan for our victim. In conclusion, for law enforcement, for all disciplines on here, follow your protocols, your policies. I am an advocate of that. Don't rush when you are there. Law enforcement, you have to take time. These are not easy. They're time consuming. They're messy. Look at the history, look at self-defense. And if you get new evidence that shows that the victim was arrested, there are ways to rectify that situation. Okay, your post-test on predominant aggressor. You've all been trained. Who is the predominant aggressor? I want to thank you for your time. Oh, actually, are we, Tamara, where are we on time?
Sorry about that, I was on mute. We still have just over 10 more minutes.
Okay.
And I don't right now have any questions for you. So I don't know if you want to go back and do that.
Yes, I will.
Skipped over. Okay, great.
I will go back to that. And if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and interrupt me. Let me go back to that. Bob and Susan. Okay, so here's my example. This is Bob and Susan. Bob and Susan have been dating. They are not married. They've lived together on and off for 4 years, so they have children. So if we look at our household member, they qualify under household member. So if there is any battery, they would qualify for or fall under domestic battery. Over the last 5 years that they've been together, there have been several incidences that police have responded to. She has always reported it. So Susan's called in, and we have arrested Bob for these 3 different times that we have gone out. Susan has gotten a protection order against Bob, so she would be the petitioner, but Susan lets Bob back into the house. He says, "I'm sorry, I miss you." He violates the PO, and then she says, "You can come back into the house. You can be here with the kids. We've got these kids together." So can we see some problems coming up already? She's going to take ownership because she's allowed him back in. One night she was in the bedroom. She's upset because Bob is still not working. She is providing for both she, Bob, and the 2 children. She is upset. She is talking to Bob and that he's not working. And she starts to put him down that he's lazy and he's not providing for his family. This infuriates Bob. He gets mad. He starts to approach Susan in the bedroom. He walks up to her. And as he walks up to her, he flinches towards her as if he's going to hit her. Now, remember, we've been out to this house 3 times before, and he's been arrested. There's a history of some violence. That's important right here because when he flinches, she's afraid that he's going to hit her. Why would she be afraid? Previous violence. She's been conditioned. She knows what's coming from him. So in her fear of him becoming physically abusive with her again, she slaps his face and pushes him. This infuriates him even more, at which point Bob reacts to this, grabbing Susan by her neck, holding her up against the wall in the bedroom, and applying pressure and squeezing her neck for several seconds. And she reports to you that she gets lightheaded, her vision changes, it kind of started to get dark, and she ends up at that point punching Bob in his face because she tells you she's afraid she's not going to be able to breathe. She's trying to tell him to stop and she can't. When we respond out there, law enforcement, Bob has, his eye is already starting to swell. He continues to strangle. She reports that he continues to strangle after she punches him. And the only thing that made Bob let go is that the children come into the bedroom and are screaming to let go of mommy. That's what makes Bob stop. When we get there, Bob has a swollen eye and there are no injuries on Susan that we can see. So here's our chronology of this relationship. On December 22nd of 17, there is a vandalism. The male is arrested for that. On 3/30 of 18, we have a felony domestic battery. We go out to this and Bob is arrested. So the male is Bob. He is arrested for felony domestic. Susan is the one that called us. So you can see that she's taken blame for this because she is the victim. On 9/26 of 18, we go to a domestic disturbance. On this one, we can't establish probable cause, so we document it. So we have a history. On 3/23 of 19, we go out again for violation of the protection order. Remember, Susan got the protection order against Bob. And when you get out there, both Susan and Bob are in the vehicle together, and Bob is ultimately arrested for violation of the protection order. It's occurring in your presence, we take him to jail. We have the arrests already. Now on 3/1 of 21, that is this case. It's a felony domestic battery. This can present problems because when you look back here at the bullet listing, she's got a PO. She's already going to take ownership and blame because she's allowed him back in the home and she petitioned for this protection order. So there's going to be some hesitation from her because of fear of getting into trouble, fear that she's going to be blamed already. It's her fault. She allowed this to happen. Also, we know that Bob has a swollen eye and she has no visible injuries. What has Bob told her? They're not going to believe you. I have the injuries. You're going to go to jail. So when we look at, history, we have several domestic violence incidents through the 5 years of their relationship, volatile. She's reported him. He came up and flinched. So we're looking at this specific assault on this date. She slaps his face and pushes him. So he will say to you, she started it. I walked up and I didn't do anything and she slapped my face and pushed me. She started this. Who does the physical touching? She's the primary aggressor because she started the touching. She was the first to touch. And his retaliatory response is grabbing her neck and strangling her. Very disproportionate response. Bob is looking for justification. She is having her neck squeezed. She is losing consciousness. She feels lightheaded. Her vision's changing. It's getting dark. She doesn't feel like she can breathe. And in her mind, she thinks, I might die. She punches him in the eye, giving him the swollen eye. The challenge is she will blame herself. She allowed him to stay there. She gave him, and she'll tell you, well, I was giving him attitude. I was getting after him for not working. And she will tell you, I hit him first. She slapped his face. These will become issues for us and challenges when we're looking at the predominant aggressor because this is the focus of what she will tell you. And he will also discuss, she started it. She wanted me to come back. I knew there was a protection order, but she begged me to be here. She was getting after me and I was just walking by when she reached out and slapped me or punched me. So he will confirm the things that she's already blaming herself. This is a frequent scenario that we can go to for law enforcement and it presents a challenge for us. We have to work through this and look past this at what else happened. Does the response by him, is that proportionate? He was looking for something to allow him to have that level of physical violence towards her. Does her punching him in the eye, is that battery, or does that fall under what we've discussed, self-defense? She's in fear for her life. Does she have the ability and the right to use violence on him in order to protect herself if she fears that she's going to die? So those are the things that we have to move past, which is why the previous slides about predominant aggressor, discussing self-defense and mutual combat are important, because she does have the right to defend herself. She's afraid she's going to die, and she used force on him to get him to stop, which he didn't. The only thing that did stop is the children. So
Sure.
defense, yeah.
We just had a couple of questions. We've got about 4 more minutes.
Okay.
What do you recommend a victim do if they are married, DV situation, and the responding officers will not document the incidents or do a report because the matter is quote unquote a civil issue, and there are no visible injuries?
So if I understand the question right, because I can't see it, the married couple,
Yeah, they're a married domestic violence situation, but the responding officers won't document the incidents or do a report because they say it's a civil issue and there are no visible injuries.
I would still encourage law enforcement to come out and ask for the report to be taken. If there's another officer, or if they can ask for at least just document it. It may not be a criminal report. If probable cause cannot be established, there isn't necessarily the ability to charge. However, it could still be a miscellaneous report, which means it's not a charging report. So I would encourage the asking of please document it on a miscellaneous report so that law enforcement does have that. If the refusal continues, for a victim especially, to document fully, keep a journal. We have stalking journals that we give out to stalking victims. I would encourage victims to document as much as they can about what happened. Date, time, place, location, who was there, who potentially could have witnessed it. Maybe they find out that there was somebody else that saw it, in which case probable cause might be able to be established. So it definitely needs to be documented. I would just encourage to continue to call. I know it can be frustrating sometimes. The more training with law enforcement, as a matter of fact, for those that may not know, I'm actually at Post right now teaching a patrol academy. And that's one of the things I discuss with them is take a report. It may not be a criminal report that can go forward on charges, but document it. We have to document this stuff with domestic violence.
Yeah, very important and good question. I think, wasn't there a case in Caldwell where they took a report, there wasn't anything there, but he ended up shooting her a week later. So it is really important that you take those reports seriously. Another question, can you discuss the CPO/PO challenges involving emotional, financial, and intimidation? I had one that was dismissed because it was not considered a cause for a CPO or /PO.
I think that we still have some work cut out for us. It's a really good question. Education in our judicial system all the way up is important as well. The more that our judges become aware of the levels of abuse, the tactics that are used by abusers in these situations, and what it is leading to, I think that as we open the door already for the harassment protection order, for those that are familiar, we did not used to have, the harassment one. That opened up several years ago. And again, as we continue to educate the judicial system on this, I think that we will start to see some of those civil protection orders staying in place for some of those levels of abuse that are in that intimate partner relationship, because those do border as well. When you're looking at the psychological and the mental, that's really on that cusp of harassment already. It fits some of the course of conduct towards stalking. So again, as we make sure that the judicial system fully understands what's happening in there, my hope is that we will see those protection orders remaining in place instead of being dismissed. And that is really through training and education as well, that continuation of it, and cases, showing the cases that we've had in the state of Idaho when protection orders were dismissed, or victims that were reaching out for help and then end up being victims of homicide. We need to use those case studies as well.
And then someone was asking about getting a copy of your slideshow. Is that something you will make available?
Yes, I definitely can. There's a couple things I noticed I need to edit on here, and then I can get it to Tamara, to you, and you'll get it to the council, I'm assuming.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, if
Yeah.
you want to make those edits, I do have the copy that you used today, but yeah, if you would like me to hold off on those edits, but I'm happy to share otherwise.
Yeah, I saw a couple things when I was going through this, so let me fix a few of those. And yes, I will make that available to you. And I'm on the last, let me get to the last one while we're talking about this. Here is, I wanted to keep that up there for a minute. My name, that is my email and my personal cell phone. You can call or email me directly for those that are on here right now. If you would like, if you have more questions, email me or call me. I can receive texts on that number. If there is more information that you want on this that I didn't cover, because there's a lot of stuff when we talk about domestic violence, I am happy to talk further with you. And then I will present or provide the PowerPoint to Tamara, so you guys will have access to that. So if I can ever be of assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. At my department, I work for Boise Police, and I am there Monday through Thursday. You can call anytime on that number, email, I will answer. If you need help on a case and you just want to run something by me, staff it with me, I am able to do that as well. So please, if I can be of assistance, let me know.
I put my email on there too. If you're not able to get that from the council's website, then you're certainly welcome to email me.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks. Thanks again, Sherri. I appreciate you doing this.
Thank you, Tamara. And I'll stay on for a few minutes.
Yeah, that's good. What, Sherri, when they were talking about no injuries, I mean, there's other reports they could take or possibly look at, like domestic assault.
There is, with assault too, you have to have the elements of assault as well met, which, you know, it has to be a threat of harm, apparent ability carried out, made to the victim, which those could all meet, and then fear. And fear is one of the elements that sometimes we may not get, which can somewhat be a showstopper a little bit, but it could still be documented. The other thing that can happen, which is, I'm a huge advocate for education and training, is if you have officers and deputies that don't know all the laws, then they're going to struggle in, is there another option? Is there another crime that this might fit? Because is it stalking? Is it harassment? You know, do we have another crime? And that can be limited when that knowledge base isn't there. So sometimes newer officers, they don't have that experience. You know, that somebody that 15, 20 years on is going to know, oh, if it's this crime. But anytime I train law enforcement, anytime, I encourage them to take a miscellaneous report, even if they don't have something that rises to criminal, so that we document every time we're out there. In addition, not only is it good to document it, but when you respond back or someone else does, we can say to a victim, which shows empathy and compassion and we care, hey, we've been out here 5 times and documented some things. You know, are you ready to talk? You know, can we figure out what's going on? Can we figure out a different plan? Wrapping them with some services. So it shows that we are, you know, interested in what's happening with them, that the compassion is there, that we're paying attention. And when we don't do that, I think we kind of lose some of that, which potentially you can also stop victims from wanting to talk.
Right. Do they still have the enhancement for destruction of property? Wasn't there a domestic violence enhancement for that?
Not for that. We have the enhancement when a domestic battery occurs in the presence of children. That enhancement is at sentencing only, but we still do have that one.
I thought for some reason, it's been a while. I was a victim witness coordinator 10 years ago, but I thought that they had an enhancement if it was like a vandalism, destruction of property, if it was in relation to a domestic situation, but I'm a little rusty.
Yeah, we've got the enhancement for in the presence of children, but the child only has to be in a position to hear or see.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be both, which is nice.
Hi, Sherri and Tamara. Sorry to jump in. I have to jump on to the next job and the next call, but you both are co-hosts, and if you want to hang out, you're welcome to as long as you need. I just have to run to the next meeting.
All right, thank you.
Yep, thanks. Have a good day. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Yep, bye-bye.
Bye.
All right.
Okay, I can go shut this down then if you want. Or,
Yeah,
okay.
and Tamara, you've got my email, so if there's any questions that popped up that I didn't get answered, let me know.
Okay.
And, I will get this to you. There's just a couple typos. I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, I missed that one.
Well, I didn't notice, so.
But I'll get that to you. And then yes, definitely you can get that sent out. Yeah, it's important for people to have the information.
Right, appreciate you sharing.
Thank you so much. And you take care. And I'm going to go back and teach these guys the rest of their day. They're getting stalking training now.
Oh, nice. All right. Thanks again.
Take care and bye-bye.
Bye.